Good morning. Welcome to San Francisco Zen Center. My name is Kyoshin Wendy Lewis, and today I will be speaking on the Chinese Zen poem, Sandokai, or Harmony of Difference and Equality. And as I was thinking about this, I saw that Anshi Zachary Smith is going to be teaching an online class called Zen Foundations, Exploring the Sandokai, that begins next Thursday, May 1st. So my talk may be a useful introduction. I think one of the reasons I was thinking so much about this poem is that when I was the doshi, or the person who leads service, for a long time on Fridays, that's one of the chants we do. So even though I was just chanting along, I think some of it started to sort of sift down more because I'm, responsible. And I think there's something about ritual. Like as I came in, I'm concerned about, giving a useful talk, but then I go around and I bow, and something else comes in. I don't know what it is exactly. But we'll see how that informs the talk. This poem, Sandokai, or Harmony of Difference and Equality, is attributed to Sekito Kisen. And if you chant the Buddhist ancestors, you'll hear his name. And he was a disciple of Seigen Gyoshi, who was a disciple of the sixth ancestor, Daikon Eno. And his story is recounted in the Platform Sutra. So part of this history is the division of Chinese Zen into two schools, the northern and southern, or gradual and sudden enlightenment schools. And Sekito Kisen's dates are 700 to 790, which is just about the whole 8th century, so he had a long life. And his poem was written, he wrote the poem about 1,300 years ago. So here it is, so present to us, and 13 centuries. So the poem begins with an overview, and you don't need to be familiar with it to follow the talk, but it begins with an overview of what it is going to address, sort of like my saying, I'm going to give a talk today on such and such. So it begins, the mind of the great sage of India, and that refers to the Buddha, is intimately transmitted from west to east. While human faculties are sharp or dull, the way has no northern or southern ancestors. The spiritual source shines clear in the light. The branching streams flow on in the dark. Grasping at things is surely delusion. According with sameness is still not enlightenment. So, in order to thoroughly understand and study this poem, a person would need to be familiar with the sort of history and historical people in Chinese Zen, particularly the 7th and 8th centuries, as well as various texts and traditions on which this poem is a commentary and explication, and also its role in the development and the continuity of Zen and Japanese Zen, which is where we have landed. So some of these resources are knowledge of the schools of Zen and the Zen lineage, the Platform Sutra, which I mentioned, and the concepts of emptiness, the absolute, and the relative, which the poem is very engaged with. And then Nagarjuna's Madhyamaka Karika, the Heart Sutra and commentaries, a work called The Awakening of Faith, Tathagata Garbha, Buddha Nature, Abhidharma Teachings, Taoism, Tendai Buddhism, the history of Japan and Japanese Zen, Dogen Zenji's teachings, and so on. So this very beautiful, simple poem is echoing all these teachings and these other commentaries. And Suzuki Roshi, Shunryu Suzuki, he gave a series of lectures, and those were compiled into Branching Streams Flow in the Darkness, Zen Talks on the Sandokai, which Zach is going to use for his class. And then Shohaku Okumura more recently wrote a commentary on it in his book, Living by Vow, A Practical Introduction to 8 Essential Zen Chants and Texts. So these commentaries imply that this is a very important chant. And in Zen history and in our practice and in the whole experience of insight. It's chanted daily in many Soto Zen temples and at the memorial of the temple's founding teacher, and we chant it at the monthly Suzuki Roshi Memorial. And a version of the last verse, "Don't waste time," is painted on the wooden han that is used to call people to Zen, which you just heard. So all of this rich history and meaning and depth and concern about the teachings and how to explain them is in this poem. So Suzuki comments in Branching Streams, some people say the Sandokai is not such a good poem because it is so philosophical. It may be so if you don't understand the background of Sekito's teaching and if your mind does not penetrate through his words. So over, time and hearing some of these teachings in talks or reading books or something, you can develop some familiarity with what he's talking about. And most of us, will just hear and chant and interpret the poem from our sort of personal experience or perspective. And those are all of that's legitimate, but it's interesting to know where it comes from and comes to us. So the overall tone of the poem is a commentary on the interactivity of the relative and absolute truths. And that is, in the light there is darkness, in the dark there is light. So they both contain each other in a certain way or talk to each other. And this interactivity neither affirms nor negates either truth. They're both always in play. And I think most of us intuitively know that in our daily lives, but to study it and to consider how it actually works or manifests is what the poem is trying to encourage. So in studies of religion and spirituality, there's found two tendencies. One is the apophatic or negative, and that's associated with developing wisdom, and the cataphatic or positive, and that's associated with developing compassion. They're not separate, but they're ways to see things or study them. And in simple terms, these could be referred to as study and application. And application is also something called praxis. It's, practice, we say, and praxis is the Latin term. And in his teaching on the Sandokai and in many of his other talks, Suzuki encourages study. And apparently he tried to get his students to study. And, I think that, I was thinking about, he came from Japan and he had a university education. And here he comes to try to teach people who have no background whatsoever in what he's offering. And I think he just wanted people to join him, Here, just read this so that we can discuss it. And so I think that was his request. And I often have requested that of students who I've spoken to, well, why don't you read this and then we can talk? How do we invite each other to engage in that way? But Suzuki then says, almost always, that zazen or meditation is the most important aspect of Zen endeavor. So I think his point is that, study informs our zazen. Like, what are we doing? What does it mean that in the light there is darkness and in the dark there is light? How does that get manifested or develop a kind of an intuition about how our mind and our body works? So I think his point is, that they are complementary, and that complementarity, if that's right, sort of gives both vitality. So the meeting or the interactivity of the relative and absolute truths, and of the apophatic and cataphatic methods, and of study and application is what I believe the poem is addressing. So generally, I think one comes to practice out of self-pity. And at first, you'd think that self-pity is part of the first noble truth of suffering. But it's actually a characteristic of the second noble truth of desire, that, wishing things to change or stay the same, or sort of becoming apathetic about everything. And the path to the deepest aspects of practice often is based in sitting in our self-pity until we feel at home in it. That is, to know ourselves intimately. And Suzuki says, Buddha's way is the study and teaching of human nature, including how foolish we are, what kinds of desires we have, our preferences and tendencies. Zen is difficult. But anyway, this is a difficult world, so don't worry. Wherever you go, you have problems. You should confront your problems. It may be much better to have these problems of practice rather than some other mixed up kinds of problems. And I think, in a way, that sort of brings us to practice and then gives practice its life for us, this kind of better to have the problems of practice than some mixed up kind of problems. So, and he isn't saying, that our problems are solvable or unsolvable, but that in the context of practice, they are our resources. They're just the aspects, of the human condition. And that means placing our relative self-pity. And I think it's good to find terms like that so that, you see what you're doing. There's something clear to look at. So this relative self-pity, putting that into relationship with eternity or equality or the absolute. And Suzuki says, the absolute truth is something we may think of as a deity. So the interactivity of the relative and absolute is a container for what might be called prayer or radical hope. And the container for this interactivity is emptiness. And the absolute, or darkness, is where there is no exchange value or materialistic value or even spiritual value. So the prayer or the hope that is engaged there, it's not a bargain. It's not like you're asking for something and expecting it and being disappointed if you don't get it, or, and this is for yourself or others. But it's this conversation that's not based on bargaining. So when he says we may think of it as a deity, to me that's something similar to how people pray. It's not, like there's a tendency to think that's a bargain. But if it's, and I think actually that's what the story of Job is about in the Bible. I think there's many interpretations of it. But it's about that your relationship to the absolute, it's not based on bargaining or rewards or relief of suffering. There's some other conversation. And this is an aspect of pastoral care. And that's, the effort of the spiritual representative is to offer a container for this interdependence of the relative and absolute to do its work. And that container can accommodate how foolish we are, what kinds of desires we have, and our preferences and tendencies, as Suzuki said, for anyone in the container. And so the role of a pastor, and in our Zen lingo, we say the practice leader or the teacher. But that role, it's, not an arrogant one of I know stuff, but it's to access a kind of bare, pre-prejudicial state of mind while upholding the principles of professional care. So this container has some conditions about it in order for it to work. So I think, again, I walked into this room and I did my bows. That's so that I acknowledge my non-expertness. And then I sit down and you hear my voice. So Suzuki refers to this in terms of love. And in his commentary on the first few lines, he explains the term ki. The capacity of the human mind has three aspects: potentiality, interrelationship, and appropriateness. So he explains that potentiality refers to both current and future possibility, as in the possibility of attaining Buddhahood, or even bodhisattvahood, if we think in those terms. Interrelationship describes the interaction between a Buddha and someone with a good nature, and between a Buddha and someone with a bad nature. And appropriateness means applying good means. If you see people who are suffering because of their ignorance, because they don't know what they are doing, you weep, you suffer with them. When you see people who enjoy their true nature, you should share their joy and give them encouragement. So these three capacities inform each other. That's potentiality, interrelationship, and appropriateness. And for the second one, he says, so ki sometimes means the interrelationship between someone who helps and someone who is helped. This is also called jihi. Ji here means to encourage someone. He means to give happiness. Jihi is usually translated love. Love has two sides. One is to give joy, and the other is to lessen suffering. To lessen someone's suffering, we suffer with them. We share their suffering. That is love. And this love, it's an offering in the sense that there is no expectation of return or response as exchange. So he's not saying, oh, I am offering this, or, you are receiving this. It's more that the person who's encouraged in their joy or supported through their suffering isn't asked or required to accept what is offered. It's more this, both people are part of this. So he describes love in the self and other way, but the context is that interrelationship that he was referring to, which means that neither person is superior or better equipped for loving. They both need to enter the container that allows for this interdependence of the relative and the absolute to work, or to do its work. And I think this is difficult and rare, and it's something we're always developing, remembering, reminding ourselves and others that that's our job as, I don't know, practitioners, human beings, whatever. Okamura says, Sekito's teachings on difference and unity are really about seeing our lives from two different perspectives as one seamless reality. So I think that this sense of the interactivity of light and darkness, or relative and absolute, is part of any experience of change or transition. And, you know, these are always happening, moment to moment, day to day, and so on. And at Zen Center in the last few months, it has just been one thing after another, to put it in, you know, conventional terms. There's been a lot of changes and transitions and other things. The first group of retirees left and moved to Enso Village, and I'll be going there soon. And City Center, as you know, was closed for renovations, so some people left, and everyone had, many people had to change their living and working situations. And all this adjustment and these changes and who's here and all those sort of things. And for, you know, there were residents who left and they're making their adjustments somewhere else, but, you know, a lot of adjustment is going on for those who are still here. And visitors to the temple, as many of you are, there's no longer, you know, that access to the building and passing people in the hallways and that sort of ordinary kind of social interaction. So that's shifted away. And a city center resident took their own life, and at Tassajara, a Sangha member died while they were out hiking. And this is just in the last few months, all of that for us, and for many of you who are not residents. And then there's the wider world events, you know. And holding all of this, and I think that for many of us, you know, feeling some extra responsibility and concern due to our spiritual vows and our intentions. And it results in responses that may vary, but I think all of our responses are true, human, they're sorrowful in some ways, and they combine both hope and despair. And when change or transition is particularly intense, time kind of moves strangely between past and future, and the present seems less accessible. So, and these events and these shifts and all these things kind of surface griefs and losses and joys and triumphs from the past, as well as a kind of a hope for avoiding future griefs and attaining future joys. So Suzuki said, time does not wait for you, so you should go on and on following reality. You cannot think the same thing always. You cannot always stop and think. You should just go on and on, making your best effort. Sometimes you feel as if you are doing something good, and sometimes you feel as if you are doing something bad. But you have to accept that you are going on and on in that way. Then you should do something, say something. So as I said, I'm moving to Enso, and I've been in the midst of this transition, packing, and doing all these things, and leaving San Francisco, where I basically have lived since I was a little kid, and even though I've lived other places, I've always returned to San Francisco. And the city has changed, but, you know, it remains so familiar. There are places I just go over and over, and people I know, and, you know, places I shop and the people who work there, and the trees and the gardens and this neighborhood, and when I go farther away, Golden Gate Park, most important, and other these little neighborhood parks that I don't know. So that, you know, that daily familiarity and navigation will change, obviously, with my move, and I will need to establish new paths and places, and I'll also be leaving Zen Center, where I've lived and worked and practiced for 35 years. So moving to Enso Village feels a bit like dying twice. You know, once in leaving everything familiar in my life, including one of my sisters who lives in the city and supportive, and then my actual death, which, if that doesn't happen in the next week or two, will happen at Enso. So is this sort of attitude facing reality or wasting time worrying and thinking? I think it's kind of both. And as relative and absolute reality meet in all of this, because I have access to it and I purposely have access to that interactivity consciously, I think moments of peace and unsettledness just keep going back and forth. And I feel that that's what transitions are about, but to have that access to always remember it, because many of you are experiencing and have experienced loss and change and endings in your working and living situations and in relationships, and the, you know, the disequilibrium that can be caused by national and world as well as local events, and the fear and the grief and the relief sometimes, boredom, numbness, excitement, and all these natural responses. But as I was saying, you know, however any of us respond, you know, this idea of impermanence and of the interactivity of the relative and the absolute can be available when things are hectic and miserable or ecstatic and liberating. And it's not a solution, but it's a perspective. In an article I was reading in the London Review of Books on artificial intelligence, the reviewer said, to be able to express new facts, language must be to some extent unpredictable, which sets an absolute limit on what a network can learn about it. To be able to express new facts, language must be to some extent unpredictable. And I think of how much language has changed since I was a teenager. The words we use, the phrases we use, the things we referred to, and then that same activity in a sense is happening, but it's been impacted by decades of the world sort of shifting and changing. So I think that type of unpredictability is also related to creativity and evolution, adjusting to circumstances. And the more predictable we hope our lives to be, the more limited they will be, of course. And yet, predictability can be a good thing, knowing some things that are happening next. But that creative working of unpredictability is also, it's something to remember, you know, every time our familiar is upended. As so I think, oh, you know, it's really beautiful up in Healdsburg. What am I worried about, you know? And that sort of thing. Or maybe I'll find things I didn't realize I was interested in. Who knows? All those kinds of things. And in his commentary on the image in Sekito's poem of arrow points meeting, it says arrow points meeting in midair, Okumura says, We shouldn't negate our individual opinions, but we have to see things as a whole. The most desirable condition is when both ways of seeing meet each other, like the arrows shot by the masters. If we can perceive a situation like that, we can be really peaceful. It doesn't happen very often because it's really difficult. So rather than, seeking after peace as some imagined state of satisfaction, the point is to not waste time. That's what the poem says. Or, in our version, I respectfully urge you who study the mystery, do not pass your days and nights in vain. So Suzuki says, Sekito says that if you practice our way in its true sense, there is no problem about being far away from the goal or almost there. Even though you work very hard, it does not always mean that you are doing the right thing. The famous koan, every day is a good day, doesn't mean that you shouldn't complain if you have some difficulty. What it means is, don't spend your time in vain. So, in the midst of whatever we're experiencing and what I'm experiencing and so on, or imagining, I think let's take that chance of thinking that today is a good day. Even while, we experience some dread or some kind of hope for things to change. And, not a good day, as he says, as being kind of comfortable, but as a touchstone to sort of accommodating the unfolding of what can't be controlled or predicted. And these, emotional and psychological components can be overwhelming. And I think the world still, now that I'm in my 70s, I somehow feel this sort of radical hope that in some form or way, the world does go on, and sometimes it's kind of sweeping us along and sometimes allowing us to rest. And it's far from complacent to say that, even though it sounds like it, because all that other stuff is still happening. It's not as though this is an escape. So Sekito's poem proposes a Zen perspective on the interactivity of the relative and the absolute, which is the container of emptiness, in which everything is included and which the relative and absolute converse through words and emotions and actions. And I describe this as poignant. The quality of this is poignant. And I recently read a description of it as ripened melancholy combined with rituals of gratitude. So, we don't have an alternative place to go, really, because wherever we go, we take ourselves and all our stuff and joys and sorrows and everything. But in this container of the relative and absolute, that interactivity, and those are expectations and fantasies and the thoughts and emotions that accompany them, in that container, they can shift and find, groundedness or peace, and approach an accommodation with reality. A ripened melancholy combined with rituals of gratitude. It's pretty practical, actually. Thank you very much. And feel free to move and yawn, cough, whatever, and there'll be, we're going to have some questions and comments.
If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone over. And we would like to invite people who may not usually speak up and ask questions to have the floor initially. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Robert. I have a particular problem that I'm struggling with, and it's with a neighbor. He is into Satanism, and we're having an altercation, and he's bothering me, and I'm trying to get out of that situation. And I'm trying to make a different situation out of it, and I'm trying to figure out what I can do with Buddhism. Love them and try to neutralize the tension between us. So I would prefer any helpful hints. Thank you very much.
Well, there are situations where, a matter of control is not so possible because there's some psychological things going on that are sort of intractable, sounds like. So in those circumstances, I think you need a lot of help. Other people to sort of intervene and mediate. And, even simpler situations require that often. But when it sounds like that's an extreme situation that you would need a lot of help with. So I don't know if that's helpful, but yeah.
Hey, Wendy. Thank you so much for your talk. I really was resonating with this idea that our unpredictability is sometimes a source of creativity, and too much predictability can be sort of stagnating and lack creativity, and then also this idea lately that I was like, yeah, everything's changing, we know that, but does everything have to change all at once? Mm-hmm. Like, too much unpredictability is just pure suffering, because the chaos is, as you say, one thing after another, really doesn't give us a chance to, it makes our practice immediate every moment, and sometimes that's just not possible, I think, sometimes, to absorb all the change. And so Kodo gave a talk on Wednesday night and mentioned that just getting up and going to the Zendo, he spoke about sort of when Suzuki Roshi died, what did they do? Well, the next morning somebody hit the Han, and we came and sat, and so sometimes our forms are the predictability that we insert on purpose. So we do things in a predictable way just to have that practice. So I wonder if is that what kind of keeps you going in the times of these?
Well, I think the forms are the sort of predictability in which unpredictability can do its work. That's what I was trying to say about the container. you have the relative going along horizontally, and you have the absolute going on vertically. So it's always happening, and sometimes you think, oh, this is too much and I'm overwhelmed, and it's perfectly reasonable to feel that way. And yet there's this container you have of the forms. So in that place, you can then, whether you're literally having the conversation, you're creating the space for it. And that's kind of what I feel about when I was referring to, seeing the teacher or practice leader. And that container allows for that as well. And there it can be spoken of. And it's not always, elegant. It's often, kind of messy. But since the unpredictability is held there, or it can be taken there, then it can do its work. Don't always know what's going to look like. Yeah. Yes, thank you.
I have a question from the chat.
Okay.
This comes from John. And John writes, does the poem highlight wisdom in knowing when to practice faith or acceptance versus study/practice?
When to do each? Is that it? Is that what it's?
Yes.
Okay.
Does the poem highlight wisdom in knowing when to practice faith or acceptance versus study practice?
Mm. Well, the sort of purpose is to, it's like when you eat, you eat. When you sleep, you sleep. When you, and so when you study, and when you sort of do practice, then that's what you're doing. Then what's happening when you engage in both of those things, or each of those things, is that they start, even though they're already working together, you start to understand how they work together and feel the sort of interactivity of the two things. The two things being myriad, but still, and that's how the it's very difficult. The poem has this difficulty teaching about relative and absolute, and emptiness has this difficulty, is you have to talk about them separately. That's how, you come up with a way of understanding them. It's to take things apart and then either put them back together as best you can and see what happens, or just allow them to talk to each other. So one thing I found useful when I was first practicing was in zazen, I would just pick one of the short chants. Often it was all Buddhas, 10 directions, 3 times, and I would just repeat it over and over, because what that ended up being was a kind of focus of meditation. You can use the breath and that sort of thing, but in the noisy city, and it was very noisy when I was first here for various reasons with the neighborhood and traffic and everything, and just repeating that. And then it became a teaching, and I started to understand what I was saying or what the words were. So I think those are various responses I would have. Is that, did the person have anything else? John, did you have anything else to say? Good enough, okay. Nope.
You define poignancy as ripened melancholia with bits of gratitude, and you also said it's practical. Could you expand on that?
Well, I think that understanding that life is not, sort of a party or something like that, or that that's a legitimate way to live, sort of develops in us, or, just even a wish to be always happy or satisfied is not either possible or practical. That's what ripened melancholy is, to understand that. It's just practical to understand that that's, our situation. And then rituals of gratitude is very practical because it reminds us that we're related to everyone who's going through whatever, whether they're happy or grieving, just like Suzuki Roshi said. So it's just practical. You just say, oh, this is this is the accommodation of reality. I don't know if that does that make sense? Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your talk. You've been practicing and living and teaching Zen for many, many years. And I'm wondering, as you're about to embark on this big transition to Ento Village, if there are things about how your practice interacts with this transition that surprise you or are particularly interesting to you, and if so, what might those be as you,
Surprise me? No, I don't. That hasn't come into it so much, no. I think maybe because I've been through so many transitions in my life and in my practice, and, changing rooms all the time, and you go to Tassajara and you're changing rooms all the time and jobs all the time, and everything's always changing at Zen Center. So I think these transitions, those happening all the time, are sort of make this like, oh, here we go, again. And at the same time, I think maybe the one surprise is that I'm sort of curious about what it means to move towards death very consciously and to be sort of separated from this mixed community and diverse in age in many other ways, and then find myself with a bunch of old people, myself included, and that's, I visited Enso, and I have to say there were just a couple of moments where it felt like a prison. Everyone has these little passes, that you have to carry around to get through, one building or another. And, everyone has, all the food is prepared and everything like that. So that'll be, that's the one big piece, I think, is to just be seen as someone who needs to be cared for and lose my independence in that way, so. But it's not a surprise. It's just like, oh, that's right. I am dying. So, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. The poem you read, the harmony of difference and equality, would you mind reading that in full one more time? It's
actually a whole poem, but shall I just read the introduction that I read?
Sure, yeah.
Oh, okay. The mind of the great sage of India is intimately transmitted from west to east. While human faculties are sharp or dull, the way has no northern or southern ancestors. The spiritual source shines clear in the light. The branching streams flow on in the dark. Grasping at things is surely delusion. According with sameness is still not enlightenment.
Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. I really like that line about the two arrow points meeting when I heard it before. And my question is a bit, is it that the two arrow points are always meeting and you're okay with it once you realize? Or is it that you want the two arrow points to meet and understand both sides of the coin in a way?
Well, Okamura describes it as a story of two archery masters, and they're going to compete. And what they end up doing is they both shoot the arrows, and the arrows meet. So it's kind of about how we have this idea of things being sort of always adversarial, like we're trying for something, or we're reaching for something, or we have to be better or the best or the worst or whatever, that we're categorizing everything in that way. So, but when arrow points meet head on, what has that to do with the power of skill? You know, it's kind of this kind of, all of that competition and worry and self-worth and everything that was going on. And he says it doesn't happen very often. So does that sort of, I wasn't quite sure what you were asking, so I'm not.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you for your talk. I have kind of a curiosity question, picking up on Buddha, that the poem starts with the teachings of Buddha, and then also, of course, the North-South, the gradual realization and the instant realization, and then getting a little bit personal, but having access to, I mean, just passing familiarity, maybe even very limited, but like Vajrayana, for example, right? And then also passing familiarity here in Zen.
You know, I can't quite hear
Where do Zen and Vajrayana and maybe this poem, where do they intersect maybe, or if they do at all?
Yeah, I would guess that there's not a direct correlation, or if I understand your question. But interestingly enough, I am very interested in teaching a class on Tantric Buddhism. So there's all, you know, so there may be something about how that, you know, how our experience of these teachings works. Like there's the thought about it, the study, and then our experience meditating. But what is actually going on? How do we accommodate it and stuff like that? And I don't think this poem so much goes into that, but it does, you know, does give you that container, this sense of the relative and the absolute, and the dark and the light, and that sort of thing. Yes, thank you.
We have another question online. This comes from Griffin at Enso.
Oh, yeah.
Griffin writes, I knew the refuge I found at City Center and lost that at Enso. Can I trust a more diverse, large community at Enso for refuge? It's as big as the world without the supportive forms. I feel it's my pride that is the obstacle and requires a new humility.
Yes, I've been wondering about loss of the sort of space of what we experience. And, you know, a lot of our life at Zen Center is not all wonderful, but it's in this context of some sort of listening for others and listening to ourselves. And I've wondered too about moving to a sort of a vague community where that's not the case, and what that will be like. So we shall see. Maybe we can create a mini internal community or something with you, Griffin, and some other people. But I do think it'll take a while, because create a new community, oh, goodness, really, you have to have a lot of, what is it exactly? Learn new ways to tolerate each other and the circumstances and your own stuff. So, yeah, should be interesting. And we're always creating new community here. Always. It's always changing, and our relationships are always changing. So perhaps that's a good sign for our ENSO as well. So did Griffin have any response?
That was from someone else.
Sorry. Okay.
I think that's all the time we have.
Okay. I was just thinking.